Welcome to our podcast, Chat with Junko and Bola. My name is Junko Yoshida, Editor-in-Chief of the Ojo Yoshida Report. In each episode, we invite a subject matter expert for conversation. We ask probing questions to provide our listeners insight and clarity on the news of the moment.
So I'll recall, if Cruise wants to correct this action, stand down and reboot nationally, because something else tragic that happens, at the end of the day right now, takes what little trust that remains in the system and will evaporate that even faster.
When California DMV announced this week the suspension of robotaxi operation by Cruise, the first person we thought about having back to our show is Bryan Reimer, research scientist at MIT. The reason why we say this is because Bryan is the one back in August at this show said that my biggest advice to Cruise is stop all operations and services in San Francisco and reboot. Of course, Cruise didn't take Bryan's advice, but look where we are today. They are in a much more difficult situation. So without further ado, here's Bryan. Progress. Okay. Well, thank you very much for coming to the chat with Junko and Bola. Thanks, Bryan. Today we have Bryan Reimer, research scientist at MIT, for this chat. But Bola, you said you want to ask the first question. I'm going to let you do it.
Thank you. You also gave me the privilege of asking the last question during a previous discussion with Bryan, and that's the reason why I wanted to ask this, Bryan. I remember saying that you were so passionate about that topic. We had talked with you before. You were insistent that things needed to change. Somebody needed to take responsibility and do something. So when what happened recently with Cruise happened in San Francisco, you came to mind right away. And that's why I want to ask you this question. When you read it, when you listened and heard everything that was going on, what was your immediate reaction? How did you feel? And who did you feel like reaching out to say, perhaps you guys should have done something before now?
So, well, first of all, and Yanko, thank you very much for having me back here. Appreciate it. First of all, it's a tragic situation, and it's the kind of situation where there is a number of factors occurring that are non-separable. I mean, one vehicle hitting a pedestrian only to be hit by a second vehicle and so forth. And it is quite tragic. And we need to take that as our first takeaway. But when you hear about the change of situations here, it's not entirely surprising. All the telltale signs of a deployment of vehicles focused on quote unquote vehicle safety, disregarding broader system safety related topics that have been talked about extensively in the news, discussed among policy, debated among academics. This is no surprise. As Phil Koopman suggested the other day, this is Cruise's Uber-like moment. And quite frankly, I agree with him. And if we continue to move following the status quo, well, it won't be the last Uber-like moment. And so I think change is needed in how we look at fitting robots into our infrastructure, how we look at utilizing those robots, how we look at proving the safety case of those robots over the long haul, and how do we bring transparency between the relationship between the public stakeholders, City of San Francisco, City of Austin, and so forth, charged with protecting the public good, and private companies here looking to leverage the infrastructure that's been created over the last century or more for new mechanisms and new meaning to providing utility to the consumers. Okay, I'm not saying it's an either or. The question is, how do we find the partnerships that enable the building of trust and the long-term sustainable nature of new mobility models?
I don't want to kind of carve up Junko's line of questions, which he had not discussed with me, but you mentioned trust. And trust fell by the wayside. It was slaughtered. It was knocked down in this particular instance. I mean, talk about trust in the broader context, because I'm sure it's something that Junko is going to jump on now. But you mentioned it in the broader context of what's happening, not just in San Francisco, but throughout this industry and the participants in it.
So it's a good question. Trust is king. Trust is created over time and eroded very quickly. But I think that we need to look at trust here through a variety of different lenses. Each of the stakeholder groups, and let's simplify that for a moment. We have consumers, we have policy, we have academic and industry experts. Each of those stakeholders has a different level of calibrated trust in the system. And I'd argue that many of the experts and academic outsiders here have had their trust in the system eroded for some time. I think policy has been increasingly at various levels. Trust there has been eroding as well, or been non-existent for a period of time. So the city of San Francisco in particular, trust in what was happening on its roads, problematic. The state of California and its regulatory oversight, perhaps a little stronger because of some of the biases that have been created there. But I think by and large, where residents of San Francisco have been in some sense outraged, in some sense satisfied based upon some of the data coming out, some collaborative work we've done with JD Power recently, I think trust in the consumer base in both California and broader is at this point beginning to decline as well. So, the events like this cause people to think, do we really need a different system? What's that system going to provide me as value? Do I really want to drive next to a robot? And these are all big things that we need to build trust around. And me, for one in particular, has a really strong belief that the future, way out there, could be 30, 40, 50, or 100 years, is highly automated mobility. Okay? The question is, how do we get there faster? How do we prove the safety case? And how do we seek the advantages that collaboration between humans and robots over the long haul can provide? And we will only do that if we build a trusted system faster.
I actually want to rewind the tape a little bit. In the very beginning in this conversation, Bryan, you mentioned vehicle safety and system safety. Can you actually break it down for us? What are the differences between vehicle safety and system safety in your definition?
Okay, that's a good question. And I'll try to boil this down for simplicity. In the context of vehicle safety, I am a vehicle operator, vehicle developer, and I am thinking about the safety of this vehicle and the actions of this vehicle from a safety perspective, very tightly focused on the vehicle itself. When I'm thinking about system safety, I'm thinking about the broader implications and the interaction between this vehicle and other elements of the road environment. So the relationship between vehicles and pedestrians, ensuring that's safe. The relationship between vehicles and first responders, ensuring that's safe. So is it safe for the other road user out there? So when we think about vehicle safety, hey, this vehicle didn't crash. It didn't hit anything. We think about system safety. I avoided situations that may have caused risk to others.
Speaking of trust, though, one of the things that it came to my mind after reading California DMV's letter to Cruz. Okay, so I don't want to stick it to DMV, but it is DMV who gave the driver's license to Cruz in the first place, and now they're revoking it. At least they're suspending the license for now, right? So, what was the original condition that satisfied them to give them a license? And now, what are the things that Cruz has to do to prove itself to get the driver's license back? Really get that, I think it's kind of DMV itself DMV exposed itself that they were actually not up to the job to give the driver's license in the first place to autonomous vehicles. What do you think?
So this is an interesting topic because I think, I've talked about for some time here, the separation between state rights and federal rights. I don't think any of the states out there have the skills required to regulate this new form of mobility. It is a very complex topic that requires a level of expertise that we can't divide by 50. So with that said, though, there's been, limited federal guidance in this area. So the states are left to their own regards to figure out how to do this. And again, this is a state right, federal right issue, and this is only one of many, many topics that we can drive down to that level. But when we talk about California DMV's, approvals of cruise operation, there have been a number of stakeholders out there, including me, but I'm not the leader there, that have questioned, what data has this been generated based upon? And what data has the California DMV demanded to provide transparency into what's going on? So at the same time, the city of San Francisco is screaming, hey, look what's happening on our roads, the state provided operating permits. So this is a breakup between local stakeholders and the state operating entities here at its finest. Okay. Now, there's been lots of reports about lobbying, about former employees serving in different places. There's a lot of questions here that as someone mentioned the other day, I think it was Missy Cummings, there's a Harvard case, the business school case study that will be written, or two or three on this, much like the foundations of the Uber situation. Because at the end of the day, the public stakeholders are failing to provide adequate oversight and protecting the rights of the constituents. Okay, that means the city and the state working together collectively. At the same time, the folks who are looking to do things on our roads that are beyond what was the state of practice a few years ago also need to be in a position to provide data that helps enhance the transparency. Look, the federal government and NHTSA in particular, through the standing general order requiring some reporting of incidences, okay, in exchange for an operating permit, it's not ludicrous to suggest that the state of California would want very reasonable performance data. Okay, transparency in the case of incident. What should remain within the state for confidentiality purposes to protect business practices? What needs to become public? NTSB has been very good over the years of threading the needle there. It's not that I believe everything should be public. We have to protect business entities here to some degree. But at the end of the day, we need to build transparency and trust, and that's just not happening here. Now, it's not happening from the state perspective, and it's not happening from the operating entities either.
And it is,
I think we can talk about an organization that's a little better out there, is Waymo, but it's still laden with a lot of the same foundational issues here. Performance of the vehicles on the road seems to be at a much higher level, but still looking at vehicle safety versus system safety, still working on the same conditional operating permits within the state, not providing as transparent data that would probably build the trust in this long-term situation or system when something does occur. And by the law of probabilities, this is not the last something.
No, that's true. The first time that I actually realized that, gosh, these guys probably really don't know much about what's going on was the couple of years ago when both Waymo and Cruise got the permission by CPUC to operate robotaxi business as a paid service. And I asked them that what gave you the impression that this is good enough to become a commercial service? And they really didn't have good answers for it. It's almost like, well, DMV already gave them a license and they seem to be doing fine. And they didn't really seem to have any threshold that if you actually reach this milestone, I'll give you the commercial license. I don't think that those conditions are really clear, at least not to the media.
So Junko, in my TEDx talk from about 5 years ago, I called for a clinical trials like structure here. You got to get through Gateway A before you're allowed to go to Gateway B. Yeah. Because I do think that we need to prove safety as opposed to assume safety. But I want to call you back here for a moment because at the end of the day, there are some incredibly bright minds at all levels of these organizations, from public policy to engineering to leadership. To marketing, communications, fundraising. There are some very, 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 very smart people involved in these companies. So the reality is when the talking point comes out that they don't have an answer, it's more likely that they don't want to provide an answer. They have some assumptions. They don't want to talk to the media. They need, but that's where it turns to the public sector to ask questions and demand answers. Put them in writing, draw a line, and look at really creating a system that demands transparency from all sides.
Does
What is
anybody have
what,
a list? Yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry.
what does the gateway need to be to get from phase A to phase B?
Yeah.
What is the performance characteristic that we believe we can meet? Again, how do we define performance characteristics? Look, that is not an easy answer. I'm not telling you that any of the companies focused on level 4 AV can really tell us coherently, 100% scientifically, what the performance characteristics should be. But we can all take reasonable, educated guesses, discuss those educated guesses, and formulate a plan that's revisable later down the road.
Right. So on that note, though, I'm still curious that when DMV wrote the letter to Cruz saying that we'll provide you a list of things that you need to meet in order to regain the driver's license, why are they not making the list, stuff on the list, public, I wonder?
Well, I think there's a number of reasons that may be the case. First and foremost, I don't think any policy member wants to be going on public record here, what that list looks like right now. And there's a bunch of reasons for that. I don't think Cruz wants to know what that list is, but from a political perspective now, the tides have turned. All of the risk in providing a continuation permit, are now borne a lot differently by the public sector and the private sector moving forward. So when the state of California, if they consider reissuing an operating or reinstating an operating permit, folks are going to ask questions.
Yeah.
If something, or better yet, when something happens again. So the regulators here are now, going to be weighted much more by the decision to allow than they were before.
Yeah.
So it is a much easier decision for the state of California to study this problem further than it is to reinstate an operating permit. On the other hand, Cruz has got a pretty heavy infrastructure in California. They have a number of other cities they are building in. If I were stakeholders in these other states and cities, I'd be asking the same questions, because the last thing you want to occur is a similar situation or having a major incident right now on the streets of a city somewhere else nationwide. So I'll recall, if Cruz wants to correct this action, stand down and reboot nationally, because something else tragic that happens, at the end of the day right now, takes what little trust that remains in the system and will evaporate that even faster. So looking at the long-term viability of this technology, we need to think about how we reboot trust, how we reboot transparency, how we move this forward over the long haul. And some would say right now, well, Cruz doesn't have the funding cycle to go over the long term. Well, that is an issue that has to be developed and fully appreciated. If you don't have the funding, expansion doesn't make sense. Contraction is the next answer. How do you get small and refocus?
You used those same words the last time we spoke. You said stand down and reboot. Well, in California now, Cruz has been forced to stand down. We don't know about rebooting yet. So the question then is, why are all of the other states where it has a license to operate, why are they waiting for something to happen before they take that same action that you've recommended for quite a while now? Are we speaking in a vacuum, therefore, Bryan? I mean, are we just, yelling in the winds?
In some sense, you have a bunch of state and city regulators out there that have drunk a lot of Kool-Aid that this is better here or this is not going to happen here. The reality is it is only a law of probabilities. And the more stress that is increased, the more pressure there is to perform, the reality becomes the more likely situations occur. We need to diffuse, reboot, give really strong and bright engineers time to reassess, hey, what can we do to improve safety, transparency, and trust in this system? And the reality is, if the answer is we don't have the funding to do that, then you have your answer.
I find it interesting, Bryan, that, despite the fact that you're asking them to stand down and reboot and then go back and do this all over again, you're not writing off this technology. You're not saying this can't be done. I mean, that's important. And I want you to explain why. Why are you not? Because there are folks in the industry who are saying this doesn't make sense. It's not going to go anywhere.
Well, I don't think this is going anywhere from an ROI perspective anytime quickly. Okay, I think that the reality is this is, we can improve the technology a little bit here. Maybe we have an AI breakthrough that improves the technology a big chunk, but the reality is highly automated mobility is going to cost more than conventional driven mobility for a while. Okay, so this is an investment model for the foreseeable future. But by and large, I am a believer in technology. Okay, I am a believer that AI will continue to provide advances. So over decades, I believe this technology will reshape how we live and move. But mistakes now will either, mistakes or smart decisions now will either accelerate our ability to meet that, or in essence, put it even further on ice. So if companies like Cruise, who are investing copiously in this technology, are capable of continuing to do so for years and years to come, we'll realize the potential sooner. Then if the technology goes completely on ice, becomes one of those case studies that, well, this didn't work. And even later on, someone begins to think about, how do we restart this? So at the end of the day, I think my advice to these organizations would be get small, get focused, figure out how to perfect the system safety of these technologies, the economic viability of these technologies, but do so by managing investments over time. Because look, we're going to have to reinvent lots of technology to get these things where we want them to be, and being there over the long haul is going to be king. This is nation state level investment, not traditional corporate ROI over a few quarters or a few years.
Well, let me switch gears a little bit, because I think, we are talking about robotaxi or the fully automated vehicles here. But I think, as far as technology advancements are concerned, we already have a lot of automated features coming into the vehicles, right? So I want to connect the dots between fully autonomous vehicle to what we call ADAS, or the advanced driving assistance systems that we already have on the road. Bryan, do you think that any of those things happening in the robotaxi world today have any impact of the kind of stuff that you're doing with the AVT, advanced vehicle technology? I mean, what's your take on this?
So I think there are connections. And I think trust is one of those big connections, is that, trust in automation as a whole is eroding here. Our interest in maintaining control, our ability to make our decisions, is as flawed as humans are at the end of the day. The reality is the vast majority of miles traveled are traveled relatively safely. So I think that we have to flip around and remember this is a trust issue at the end of the day, a trust and automation issue that is actually beyond the car. So how do we begin to leverage more advanced technologies? How do we connect them to humans? How do we begin to ensure there's transparency where the benefits of these technologies are and the limitations, so that we as humans can be better integrated, human-centered autonomy, human-centered systems. How do we as humans get supported by these technologies more effectively? When we think about the ADAS market, the advanced driver assistance systems, advanced driver support systems that we're studying as part of AVT, what are we studying? We're studying a little bit about system performance, and we can see differences between manufacturer A and manufacturer B there. But at the end of the day, we're much more interested in how the human is interacting with these systems. The human is learning to interact. The human is adapting. And what do we see? At the end of the day, year by year, the human is changing. Look, it's no mystery. Automation has been reshaping driving behavior and kinematics on the road for years. Power steering, automatic transmissions, anti-lock brakes, all elements of automation being infused into the vehicle. So who would ever thought that, in my mind, using Malcolm Gladwell's words the best, the tipping point in distracted driving would be automatic transmissions? Okay, why the tipping point? Because at the end of the day, that freed resources from having to think about shifting, having to touch the stick, push the clutch, and allowed me to do other things. It was really much harder to hold the phone up to your ear when you're shifting at the same time, let alone texting. No, I'm not saying this doesn't occur. It's just harder.
Right. All right. So the it's I guess what I wanted to know is I think last time we talked about checks and balances that are required in automotive industry in general. And I think the robotaxi, the case of Cruise, is one prime example for this checks and balances did not seem to exist until DMV came in and made this announcement of suspension. So when it comes to ADAS, though, where do you think checks and balances exist, and who's doing that?
So that's an interesting question. Unfortunately, there is not enough checks and balances here in this system. And we see that in one large electric vehicle manufacturer who has really pushed the use and accelerated the use of assisted driving features. And that's obviously Tesla. Now we see a lot more conservative adoption of these features by traditional OEMs. A lot more R&D efforts put in there, a lot more thought, and Super Cruise and Blue Cruise bring cohesive system developments to this. Integrating driver management and driver monitoring features with the automation to provide a level of safety that and oversight with the systems that just doesn't exist with autopilot. But at the end of the day, is that enough? I think that's an open question that no one has an answer to. And enough for phase one, initial deployments, doesn't necessarily mean that's enough for phase two or phase three. As we move forward, in my mind, how safe is safe enough? Well, safer than we were yesterday. We need to think about continual process evolution. We need to think about getting better year by year. We're not going to drive to Vision Zero overnight, but we need to think about the systems that we're deploying and how year by year, month by month, day by day, we are making them safer, we are making them more convenient, and we are leveraging the power of technology to do better. So, no Hail Mary passes here. Iterative, stone-wise steps forward is probably going to get us where we need to go faster. So when we think about systems in the vehicle today, there are a lot of parties globally that are working to help promote system safety here. Your NCAP, IHS, Consumer Reports are always in the news with different facets of information. NHTSA is obviously talking about, defects investigation in a bunch of areas. We've seen very limited action here, and some, action on the Cruise side as well. But at the end of the day, we need to be thinking about a cohesive system forward that allows automakers to innovate, but to do so but at the same time as providing transparency to the consumer on what these systems are, what they are not, and ensuring that there is some reasonable regulatory oversight over the long haul if things don't go the way they planned. And I am open to be critiqued that in many cases today, we are working on technology that we don't know perfectly how it's going to go. Quite frankly, consumers behave differently than all of the testing and pre-testing we can do as an industry. And that's something we have to accept. It's much like, as I've talked about before, the clinical trials architecture. You got to prove you can walk before you're allowed to run. You got to run before you're allowed to sprint. But once you're allowed to sprint, we need the phase 4 structure in place that if it doesn't work, we learn that over the long haul. And the folks that are being transparent, are providing data back, deserve some protections for that. We can fix automotive technology in many cases more effectively. We can turn it off instantly through OTA. We can enhance products through OTA or dealer-delivered upgrades more effectively. We reshape the pharmacological concoctions that we have in medicine or medical devices. So we have the ability to infuse change out there, but we have to be encouraged to leverage that. And that may very well at the end of the day mean we need to be thinking about liability reforms. Liability reforms for organizations that are using the data effectively to drive innovation and advance convenience and allowing people to drive when they would not have been able to. Whether that's older adults, whether that's teens, whether those who are otherwise mobility impaired. but also ensure we are moving the safety needle forward productively over time.
Junko, I've got one last question for Bryan, and it comes from what he just said and the question you asked. You talked about ADAS and AV, and Bryan, you kept using the word we, which means it's a group. And right now, I wonder if all of these varied members of that we group, as a leader who's empowered to help drive some of these changes that you insist must take place, do we have that leader?
And I think the answer
organizationally,
we don't. I mean, you would hope there would be federal leadership here. NHTSA, NHTSA is an agency that has, a reactionary regulatory charter by nature. It's not proactive. There's more proaction in Europe than there is in the U.S., where we do see safety advantages taking hold much more strongly. I, for one, believe we need to look at synergies between the European and the American marketplace. These are expensive technologies, and synergies are likely reduce the cost point faster. So, automakers in many senses are taking the lead with input from suppliers. But at the end of the day, I think, it really does come back to public-private partnership. Okay, we need the public stakeholders protecting the public good, looking for transparency, looking to understand that the private sector is doing right. But the private sector is not the OEMs alone. The insurers, other safety stakeholders, the suppliers all have a role here as well. We need to listen to that, and we need to think about how do we recraft auto safety as a balance between convenience and safety long term. If we want to make a perfect safe car, we can probably do that. We just can't afford that. It's not going to be sustainable in the long haul. It's not going to provide the mobility advances we also desperately need. So there is a cost by not providing mobility. And we need to be recognizing at the end of the day that there are trade-offs here. We need people to be able to afford to buy cars. We need them to be able to go out and get ice cream, groceries, medicine, go to the doctor, take their kids to school. But at the end of the day, we need to do the best job we can in that complex optimization question of protecting safety as well. And I say very complex optimization question, because, hey, make a safer car, but the price of vehicles goes up by 50%. That doesn't necessarily help us either. So these are the complex trade-offs that I respect vehicle manufacturers have to make. And that's not easy. But I think those are the complex trade-offs that we need policy support for. And we need to be thinking about not how do we make the safest vehicle we can, how do we balance safety with convenience, cost, et cetera, and how do we improve that balance year by year faster so that we can reduce the number of fatalities on the US and global roads. The real key to me is how do we improve the system? Not how do we get the system to zero. That's the big long-term goal. Year by year, month by month, day by day, how do we ensure we're doing better?
And for us to know that how we are doing better, we need to have the transparency, right? I mean, it's like there are some instances that the companies are not providing exactly what happened in whatever accidents. I mean, it's there have been some discrepancies that have been reported, but I think that's the kind of things that regulators can actually, in exchange, can actually demand.
But demand, but in Junko, I think it should be the kind of piece at the end of the day that the private sector needs to begin to appreciate that this is a societal issue, that at the end of the day, society deserves transparency. I know this is very difficult in the complex world we live in right now, but at the end of the day, if we want these technologies to succeed long-term, transparency, trust are some of the pivotal measures. Now, I'd love to see, DC help encourage this, as opposed to DC saying, here's how it's got to be. I think we need to have a two-way dialogue, and both sides being willing to meet somewhere in the middle in building that trust, building that transparency, and building a better system.
Right. Very good. On that note, we will have you back, Bryan. Try to check in and what progress we're making. But this was the really milestone. I mean, this is something we had to cover. We had to look back, and we'll see where this automation goes in the automotive industry.
Well, yes, we will, and hopefully it's around for my grandkids to experience.
I like your thinking long term.
Yeah,
Oh,
real.
Yeah,
Hopefully,
it's
real.
not going to be tomorrow, right? It's
Oh,
no.
But again,
Okay.
it is look. I can see scenarios where it all disappears and then comes back later on. But I think that we will all be best served as a society if the automation is continued to evolve to a viable product and a viable service. But it's going to evolve there over time. It's got a season.
The prayer from my side here, Bryan, the last time you were right, and somebody paid a price in San Francisco. I hope that the next time that you're right, it's because we've actually moved the needle beyond what you're talking about now, and we've jumped to the next phase.
Me too.
All right. Well, thank you so much for your time. We'll talk soon. Okay. Thank you.
My pleasure.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.